Okay. So good to see everybody back in town here. And this week, our Torah portion is Acharei Kedoshim. God willing, next week, I'll be at Har Sinai, so I won't be able to study with you with the Torah portion. But God willing, I'll bring you back great discoveries that I find there. So there's a double portion this week, and so we'll study Acharei Mot today, and God willing, on Wednesday we'll study Parashat Kedoshim. So we will break it up, and we'll get a little bit of each one each time. I want to focus at the start on two verses, seemingly innocuous verses. But first, an overview. What is Parashat Acharei Mot about? Parashat Acharei Mot, the majority of the portion is actually the Torah reading for Yom Kippur. We read in the morning of Yom Kippur, at the beginning of the portion, which is the service of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur. And on the afternoon of Yom Kippur, we read the end of the portion, which is the list of the prohibited relatives who one is not allowed to have to marry and have marital relations with. So the beginning of the portion details the service that the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, does on Yom Kippur in order to achieve purification and atonement from Hashem. In that context, I want to turn to two verses in chapter 16, verse 12 and 13, describing the Kohen Gadol's practice. It states in chapter 16, verse 12, that as part of the service of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur, he shall take a firing pan, filled with coals of fire. He takes them off of the altar. Which altar is he taking them from? He's taking them from the golden altar. There are two altars in the temple. There is an altar right outside the temple in the courtyard. That's called the altar of earth, or the altar copper, or the altar of the sacrifices. And then there's an inner altar that's actually in the sanctuary. That's the golden altar, sometimes also called the incense altar, because what went on there was every single day was the incense. And then on very rare occasions, like Yom Kippur, some blood was placed upon there, but an animal itself was never sacrificed on that altar. So he takes the fire pan filled with coals of fire from the altar before Hashem, and in his hands he takes a fistful of ketoret, of incense, ketoret samim, of incense, daka, really finely ground, and he brings it mi beit laparochet. So there's the golden altar, which is in the sanctuary, and he's taking this this pan filled with fire, and he's also taking a handful of incense, and he's bringing it into the Holy of Holies, which is an inner room in the sanctuary. And he places v'natana ketoret al ha'esh b'fnei Hashem, and he shall place the incense on the fire before God. So he shall place the incense on the fire before God. And then when he does that, when you place incense on fire, what happens when you place incense on fiery coals? It makes smoke. And then the cloud of incense will cover the kapores. The kapores is the cover of the ark, this golden plate that covers the ark. Acharei, this kapores is above the tablets, the luchot, v'lo yamut. He should do this so that he doesn't die, meaning to say, he has to do this properly. He has to do this action properly. This ceremony seems innocuous, right? He takes some incense, some fire, pours them on the fire, and that makes smoke and covers the cloud of glory. Now, This actually was considered the most difficult service in the temple. I'll just read from here for you Rabbi Soloveitchik's description of it. Rabbi Soloveitchik wrote about this in Nora'os Harav, volume 6, page 182. He writes as follows. He says as follows. He writes, "He shall place the incense upon the fire before the Lord." The Mishnah describes the procedure of the Kohen Gadol's offering of the incense. So this way you can understand it. Chapter 5 of Yoma, Mishnah 1 and 2. The Kohen Gadol would take the incense ladle, meaning the incense would be in a ladle in his left hand, and he would take the pan of coals in his right hand. So he's walking, with one hand is the incense in a spoon, the other hand is this hot pan of coals. He would then enter the Holy of Holies. Remember that. He's then, according to the Mishnah, he's entering the Holy of Holies. He placed the pan containing the coals on the floor in front of the ark. Now that was during the first temple. In the second temple, they no longer had the ark, so he placed it on a rock that was 3 fingers width off the ground, and that was called the foundational stone. And that rock is still there. That's the belief. That was the stone that was used to create the world. And so when he places the fire pan down, he now has his right hand. And then he would take the ladle of incense and he would hold it between his thumb and his palm. Or he would take it, according to some, between his teeth and then pour it into, because he had to fill up the entire amount of incense from the ladle into the palm of his hand without dropping a single particle. So he poured from his teeth into both hands like this. And then he would pour that onto the coals. And he couldn't drop a single speck of the incense. And the Talmud Yerushalmi notes that although during the first temple, the ark itself provided light, there was the divine light came from the ark. During the second temple, the Holy of Holies had no ark, so it was completely dark. So therefore, he has to do this in the dark. And this was, Rabbi Soloveitchik says, an almost superhuman feat. Okay. So, again, this seems pretty straightforward. Very hard task. If he drops some incense, he's done something, he's messed up, and he's not good enough. But this little gathering, this little activity, became the source of a major fight. An intense fight. In what way was it an intense fight? So the Talmud in Tractate Yoma in the first chapter tells us as follows, that when the Kohen Gadol was preparing, the high priest was preparing to serve in the temple, they brought him up. The elders of the court handed him over to the elders of the Kohanim. They brought him to the Beit Avatinas. The Beit Avatinas was where they prepared the incense. He needed to learn this procedure. Vishbi'uhu. And then the elders of the Kohanim made the Kohen Gadol take an oath. And after they made him take an oath, it says that he would look away from them and cry. And they would look away from him and cry. So why are they making him take an oath? And why are they looking away and crying? So I'll give you the background, and then we'll read this story from the text of the Talmud, Tractate Yoma 19b. There was in the time of the Second Temple, which is around, the temple was destroyed in the year 70, but we're talking about right around the year 0. There was a major dispute between the rabbis, who are the transmitters of the oral law, called the Prushim, the Pharisees, and the Kohanim, who were power brokers in the temple, and they were called the Saddukim, the Sadducees. And they were fighting over the rituals. So therefore, they're making him take an oath that he has to follow the rabbinic, the Pharisaic interpretation of how to do the ritual, and not the Sadducean interpretation of how to do the ritual. So he would look away and cry that they suspected him of being a Sadducee, and they would look away and cry that they were suspecting him of being a Sadducee. So now that we have that out of the way, let's read the story in the Talmud. Just make sure nobody has any questions. Okay. So if you have a question, just raise your hand, then I can address it. So moving along, the rabbi said the following story. It says, why were they crying? Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi taught, whoever suspects somebody who's actually a non-guilty person, you're going to get afflicted all over your body. And so therefore they were crying that they had to suspect him and make him take an oath. What was their big concern here? Says the Talmud. Kol kach lama. What was their big concern? What did they think he was going to do? What did they think he was going to do? The rabbi said there was a concern. Rabbi Soloveitchik said that he walked into the Holy of Holies, and there was where he poured the incense onto the coals. But why were they making him take an oath? Because they were concerned they were concerned that he not pour the incense onto the fire coals outside of the Holy of Holies while he's still in the sanctuary. That would have been physically a lot easier. There would have been light there, and it would have been a lot easier for him to do it there. And that's what the Sadducees said. The Sadducees said, pour the incense onto the fire while you're in the main sanctuary, before you go into the Holy of Holies, the separate room. The rabbi said, do we pour it on the coal in the Holy of Holies? This was the major fight. And it was based upon how you interpret the verses. Because the rabbi said, you shall take from the fire pan, from the altar, and you shall put the incense on the fire before God. And that will cover over the ark and will fill it up with earth. But the Sadducees said that you're supposed to put it before you entered in, because they interpreted the verse, going back to verse 2 in this chapter, which stated, God said to Moshe, speak to Aaron your brother, and it says in that verse, with a cloud I shall appear to you above the kaporet, meaning to say that when they entered into the Holy of Holies, there already had to be a cloud. So that's why the Sadducees said you need to do the fire with the incense outside of the Holy of Holies, so that when you're walking in, there's already the Holy of Holies. So therefore, they had to make the high priest take an oath. So now, what happened? They fought. There was a big fight about this every year. That's why they had to make him take an oath. That's an indication that they were fighting. And I'll read to you the story from the Talmud. There was a story about a high priest, Maisa B'Tzdukiach. There was a story about a Sadducee. They didn't realize he was a Sadducee. They didn't realize that he was a Sadducee. If they had realized he was a Sadducee, they obviously wouldn't have appointed him to be the high priest. And what this Sadducee did, I'll read. He prepared the incense outside the Holy of Holies. And and then he brought it into the Holy of Holies. He prepared the coals with the fire outside, and he brought it inside. This was the custom of the Sadducees. B'yitziato, and then when he's leaving the Holy of Holies, Hayasameach Simcha Gedola. He was so happy because he said, "We got it right this time. This year we did it our way." Pagabo Aviv, his father, encountered him when he was leaving. Amar Lo, his father said to him, "You're not acting right." This is what the Sadducees said. The older man said to his son, excuse me, he said, even though we're Sadducees, and we think that we're supposed to do the ritual the way we think we're supposed to do it, which is make the smoke outside, Misyarin anu min aprushin. We really have fear of the Pharisees. Excuse me. Excuse me. He said, we have fear of the Pharisees, and we don't, even though this is what we think we're supposed to do, we don't actually do it. Meaning the older Sadducees were saying, we don't actually do this. Yeah, that's the way we think is right, but we don't actually do this. Amar Lo, so his son said to him, why not? My whole life, I was upset about this verse. Because the verse says, when with the cloud of glory, I shall come to cover the ark. And I shall see the kapor, the ark, with the cloud of glory. And my whole life I was saying, Matai yavo yadi, and my whole life I was saying, when will I have this opportunity? When will be my opportunity to interpret the verses the way I think they're supposed to be interpreted? Now that I finally have the chance, will I not fulfill it? So this implies, and in the Jerusalem Talmud implies, that this was the first time it was ever done. There are a lot of Sadducees who interpret it this way, but nobody had ever had the chutzpah to change the practice. But here was the Sadducee, and he was saying, we're going to do it my way. I'm going to break with the tradition. They said, Amru lo ayu yamim muatin ad shames. It wasn't long before this man died. And he died with an unusual death. He died very young. And they tossed him into the trash. And the worms were coming out of his nose. And some say, some say that right when he exited the Holy of Holies, he was struck down immediately and died. The Tani, Rabbi Chia, kamin kol nishma ba'azara. There was a sound heard in the temple when he left the Holy of Holies. Sheba malach, that an angel came and struck him across the face. And his brothers, the Kohanim, came in to see what was going on. And they found basically that there was like that there was this foot of a calf between his shoulders. And they understood that the angel had struck him in his feet. As it states, Viraglayem, Regel Yeshara, B'kaf Raglayem, Kikaf Regel Ego. That's what the verse says. So basically, to summarize what happened here was, there were two ways you could do this ritual. Either you could pour the incense on the fire in the Holy of Holies to make the smoke, or you could do it outside the Holy of Holies and then walk in with the smoky pan. The rabbi said to pour the incense on the fire when you're in the Holy of Holies, and this Sadducee did it outside, and his father, who was himself a Sadducee, was shocked. And this man said, I've been waiting my whole life to bring this into practice. And as a consequence, he died, either immediately when he left or soon after. So first of all, let me pause here, see if anybody has any questions. I don't see anybody having any questions. Okay, I see. No, okay, we have one question. Hold on one second. Let me just. Okay. So I want to make a few points here about this. Basically, 3 points that I wanted to make. 3 points I wanted to make are, first, is a very, very important point from this Gemara. A very important point, which I think is incredibly relevant for us today. That even the Sadducee, the older Sadducee, was looking at his son with tremendous suspicion and alarm. And he was saying, yeah, I understand in theory that we're arguing you should deviate from the tradition, but in practice, we would never actually do that. We were just talking in theory, right? All we have is our tradition. You want to act on our theory, our interpretation to change the text, to change the practice. We've had this practice since the time of Aaron, and now you want to come along and change it. And that's a very important argument against changing our rituals and our customs on the basis of our own interpretation, or the fact that we think, oh, this will make it better, or this is a clearer interpretation. And the older Sadducee was saying, you're literally playing with fire. And he's saying, this is a big mistake. That's what he was saying. This is a big mistake. Don't do it. That's the first point I wanted to make. The second point I wanted to make, I wanted to read to you. I saw two explanations of, this partially answers Bruce's question, but it's two explanations about what's the difference between what the Sadducee was saying, what the Sadducees were doing, and what the rabbis were doing. So first, we'll take it from the Tzantzar Rebbe. The Tzantzar Rebbe, I'll read it as follows. He says, "A manig Yehudi amiti, a true Jewish leader, mavir techila belibo, who at eish avodas abore. First, he inspires himself in his own heart, the fire of God. And only afterwards is he able to transmit the fire into other people's hearts. Because he's only once he has these spirituality literally emanating from his own heart, can he then transmit it into somebody else's heart. Whereas a false leader, a leader who wastes his time, he starts teaching and giving rebuke, even though his heart is far away from it. First, what he does is to arrange something outside and then bring it into to himself. That's not the way of the sages. So he says the Sadducees they were trying to light the fire outside, external, and bring it in. And the Tzantzar is saying, no, first you have to light the fire internally and then bring it out. That's what the Tzantzar says. But the Drash Ve'ayun, the Raisha Rebbe, he says like this. He views the Sadducees as not just the sect who was around in the time of the Second Temple, but he views them symbolically as a reference to all the sectarians who were trying to deviate from rabbinic teachings throughout Jewish history. And he says, what's the way of the Sadducees? That they want to change our faith. They want to institute changes into our faith. And they're doing it on the basis of what they see externally. They want to take their external vision and bring it into the sanctuary of the Jewish people. And that's why the sages are doing all this, to uproot it from the hearts of the Sadducees. Whereas the sages, it has to come from inside. Meaning to say, the Sadducees want to light the fire outside and then bring it into the Holy of Holies. Whereas the rabbis are saying, no, the fire has to be lit inside the Holy of Holies, and only then can it be brought outside. And that's the difference between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. That's what the Drash Ve'ayun. And just so you know, the Drash Ve'ayun was not somebody who was afraid of. He was not somebody who was afraid of the external world. He was somebody who was very much aware of the external world. He was living in Lviv. He was dealing with the multicultural cosmopolitan town. But nevertheless, that's what he's saying is what's going on here. This powerful idea that the fire of our inspiration, first and foremost, has to come from the pure place. And only then can we bring it externally. And that's I think to me, a very powerful point, that as we look for inspiration, that we have to look first and foremost to inspiration that comes from the base of the Torah, and not try to, because there can be so many things that are inspiring to us in life, but if it's ultimately not coming from the source of Torah, then it's like if you're, let's say, trying to draw the plans for a building, and if you're a little bit off at the outset, that mistake will just keep growing bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger until it's humongous. And so therefore, at the outset, it has to come from the source of Torah, or else, God forbid, the mistake will just grow bigger and bigger and bigger. Anyway, I just want to pause for a second. If anybody has any questions about this, I'm happy to address it. Any questions?